On April 7, 1994, Rwanda's horrific events broke out, resulting in 3 months of brutal massacres of 1 million people in an area smaller than the state of Maryland. What is strange, though, is that 1 generation later, Rwanda became one of the most peaceful and rapidly developing countries in Africa. Let's get to the bottom of what led to the tragic events called the Rwandan Genocide. But before we begin, make sure you've subscribed to the channel and hit the bell icon to stay updated with future content. The average person knows almost nothing about Rwanda. It's not even easy to find it on a map. Its people, Banyarwanda, after whom it's named, consist of 3 national groups. It is composed of the most numerous Hutu, Tutsi, who make up about 15% of the population, and a quite small number of Twa Pygmies. And we should note that the Hutus are farmers who came to this land in search of new arable land. Their skin is brown, their bodies are rather strong, and they are small in stature. Later, the Tutsi cattlemen came from the north and took most of the power in their hands in spite of their small population. The Tutsis look more like Somalis or Ethiopians. They are taller than the Hutus and practically black. Both tribes speak the same language and, apparently, are almost identical in appearance. From the mid-14th century, several tribal princedoms were formed on the territory, which by the end of the century merged into a single kingdom under the Tutsi rule. Later, the territory was discovered by the Europeans, led by the British General John Speke, and subsequently conquered by the Germans. At the end of World War I, the League of Nations passed a resolution granting Belgium the right to govern the kingdom's territory. The Europeans noticed that the Tutsis were more like Europeans than the Hutus and the Twa Pygmies. Instead of excluding them from power, they actively supported and encouraged them. The end of colonial rule prefigured the reaction of the Hutu majority. The Tutsis were deprived of power and persecuted. Soon, numerous Tutsi communities sprang up in neighboring states who were not going to accept the loss of their homeland, forming military organizations and raiding Rwanda. In some way, the Hutu elite found it convenient. The public image of an enemy who had lost power and was secretly acting from abroad contributed to the idea that if people did not support the current rulers, the former colonial henchmen would gain control, all the more since their tribesmen were still living in the country. Basically, this did not pose much threat to the Tutsis who remained in Rwanda. They lived side by side with the Hutus, and the relationship was as it usually is between neighbors, i.e. very different. But at some point, there emerged real reasons for the Hutus' implicit fears. The authoritarian regime of President Juvenal Habyarimana showed less and less credibility. The people of Rwanda had tired of him for 2 decades. The demands of democratization led to questioning the rights of national minorities as well. At that moment, one of the military groups of Tutsi exiles, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, broke out in combat actions. The RPF was led by the current president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame. After conducting several raids on Rwandan territory, it defeated the National Army and imposed strict conditions of a political agreement on Habyarimana. According to them, Tutsi refugees had to be returned to the country. Moreover, the RPF members got 50% of the government and military positions. This was literally the embodiment of the Hutu nationalist fear that the minority they hated would return to power. Realizing that the state was powerless, they decided to act on their own. Nationalist militias and anti-Tutsi propaganda spread throughout the country, leading to the formation of youth militia groups that were trained and armed by the army. Chauvinistic propaganda leaflets calling for the extermination of the Tutsi were distributed. But since most of the population was illiterate, the radio was much more popular. In the 1990s, Rwanda was such a poor country that most people used radio as a media outlet. A man owning a TV was considered rich here, and most people in Rwanda could only watch TV in the showcases of stores. On April 6, 1994, a plane carrying Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana was shot down as it approached Kigali. He was just returning from Tanzania, where he was discussing ways to resolve the conflict. It remains unknown who arranged the attack, but this event triggered the outbreak of massacres and chaos. Hutu radicals killed the Prime Minister, her husband, and 10 Belgian soldiers guarding them. Moreover, politicians who advocated peace with the Tutsis were also killed. Military forces came to power, creating an anti-Tutsi propaganda campaign whose influence would have made jealous even Goebbels. The main propaganda slogan was, "Exterminate the cockroaches." We all know that propaganda is a lethal weapon. Still, many believe this to be an exaggeration. But the Radio Televisión Libera del Mil Colline, free radio and television of the Thousand Hills, tells a different story. The name for the station was chosen for a reason. Rwanda has a very complicated topography and is full of hills. Because of this, the signal reception even in neighboring villages can differ greatly. The Hutu radio station did not just encourage the killing and maiming of Tutsi neighbors, its announcers read out the names and addresses of people who were enemies of the people. Many of those whose identity were broadcast were murdered, mutilated, or raped. At all cost, all Inkotanyi, members of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, have to be exterminated in all areas of our country, whether they reach at the airport or somewhere else, but they should leave their lives on the spot. Some passengers may pretext that they are refugees. Others act like patients and others like sick nurses. Watch them closely, because Inkotanyi's tricks are so many. Does it mean that we have to go in refugee camps to look for people whose children join the RPF and kill them? I think we should do it like that. So said radio host Habimana Cantano on the morning broadcast on May 23, 1994, and he was not the only one who acted so. The Hutus were exposed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The venom of hatred was impregnated in everyone, from children to the old people. Another newscaster taught how to recognize the enemy by external signals. We will kill and destroy them all. We will succeed because they all belong to this ethnic group. We have to look at the physique and the appearance of the person. If you see a small nose, break it. If necessary, we will spend a year fighting these cockroaches, exterminating them all. At the same time, the so-called the Hutu 10 Commandments were published and repeatedly broadcast on propaganda radio channels. They stated the following. 1. Anyone who marries a Tutsi woman, befriends her, takes her as his mistress, is considered a traitor. 2. Hutu daughters are more suitable in their role as woman, wife, and mother of the family. 3. Hutu women, be vigilant and try to bring your husbands, brothers, and sons back to reason. 4. Every Hutu should know that every Tutsi is dishonest in business. Anyone who makes a partnership with Tutsi in business is considered a traitor. 5. All strategic positions, political, administrative, economic, military, and security should be entrusted only to Hutu. 6. The education sector, school pupils, students, teachers, must be majority Hutu. 7. The Rwandan armed forces should be exclusively Hutu. No member of the military shall marry a Tutsi. 8. The Hutu should stop having mercy on the Tutsi. 9. The Hutu, wherever they are, must have unity and solidarity and be concerned with the fate of their Hutu brothers. 10. The Hutu ideology must be taught to every Hutu at every level. Any Hutu who interferes with this is a traitor. In some places, the signal reception of propaganda radio was excellent, and in others, there was no signal at all. As a result, the impact of the radio on the population could be determined very accurately. Further investigations revealed that there were 10% more Tutsi casualties in areas where the radio was working fine. Even assuming that the number of genocide victims was 1 million, at least 100,000 of them were the responsibility of free radio and television of the Thousand Hills. However, this estimate is inconclusive because the villages that had no radio but were nearby to those with good radio signal also had unusually high murder rates of Tutsis. The retelling of the propaganda, amplified by their neighbors' voiceover, forced them to grab their hoes and exterminate the cockroaches. The mass murder weapon of this massacre was the machete. In 1993, businessman and journalist Felician Kabuga and other anti-Tutsi hardliners imported into Rwanda machetes in much larger quantities than were needed for agricultural, as well as other tools that could be used as weapons, such as razor blades, saws, and scissors. These utensils were distributed throughout the country, supposedly for civil defense. The Tutsis were killed not only by the military but also by civilians. The army distributed machetes for free. On the roads, they checked documents specifying one's nationality at the time. If a person was a Tutsi, he or she was usually killed on the spot. Neither children nor the elderly nor women were spared. To be fair, some Hutu representatives were much more humane. Risking their own lives, they saved Tutsi refugees from imminent death. The famous story of hotel manager Paul Rusesabagina, who used his high social status and financial wealth to shelter hundreds of people in the hotel. The thugs combed all the houses looking for Tutsis. Their homes were burned and their possessions were stolen. The Tutsis, in turn, sought refuge in schools and churches. Some were hidden by priests, and some were betrayed. Many Tutsis were killed or given to killers by their neighbors, friends, and colleagues. Importantly, it was not only the Tutsis who were massacred, but also the so-called moderate Hutus, those who sheltered or supported the persecuted. Tutsi women were usually first raped and then killed. Many survivors were infected with AIDS. The Tutsis sought help from UN peacekeepers, but they could not use weapons because the UN Charter meant direct intervention. Hutu fighters took advantage of this clause by capturing people one by one. Europeans and Americans evacuated their citizens and did not intervene in the conflict. The Clinton administration opposed the UN mission, after which the Security Council ordered the peacekeepers to leave the country immediately. Only a couple of hundred of Canadian General Romeo Dallaire's 2,500 soldiers remained. Determined and heroic, ignoring orders from their superiors, the general and his soldiers defended the Tutsis to the last man, creating special areas of refuge. The massacre stopped after the RPF fighters, led by Paul Kagame, took control over Kigali in July, while the defeated Hutu government fled to Zaire. According to official figures, about 1 million people died in 100 days of carnage. Kagame later became vice president of Rwanda and minister of defense. He became president in 2000. He was re-elected several times and succeeded in doubling the GDP and developing the economy and technology. No wonder that in today's Rwanda, many people consider Kagame a national hero. Justice has been served. Although hatred has not disappeared, the massacres have been stopped. In November 1994, the UN set up an international tribunal for Rwanda. The perpetrators are still being found and tried. During the International Tribunal on Rwanda, thousands of perpetrators were brought to justice. Among them were the hosts of Free Radio and Television of the Thousand Hills. They all portrayed remorse, blaming the government and their own ignorance. Most of the journalists received heavy prison sentences. Some people, such as speakers Bernard Mukingo and Valerie Bemeriki, got life sentences. At that trial, Valerie Bemeriki said the following in her last statement: "I called for the Hutus to kill Tutsis. I had to disclose on air the places where they were hiding. The organization of the genocide was extremely thorough. We received information about their locations at all levels. On the radio, we explained that the Tutsis were hiding so that they could attack the Hutus. We made a terrible mistake. We were not vigilant. Yes, we believed what our authorities said. We trusted them. We admit that we have sinned, so today we kneel and ask forgiveness." Unfortunately, the main propagandist, Habimana Cantano, escaped justice. The disgusting star of the radio station was not at all a bookless, sleazy, and deluded person like Bemeriki. Cantano came from a wealthy Hutu family close to government officials. He graduated with honors from high school in the Rwandan capital of Kigali and then studied in the USSR. Habimana mastered the art of propaganda in the journalism department of Leningrad University. Back home, the graduate had been publishing a nationalist newspaper for some time. On Free Radio and Television of the Thousand Hills, he immediately became a key figure. Cantano skillfully manipulated listeners with jokes, historical excerpts, and quotes of the greats in his broadcasts. Although the propagandist managed to flee to the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo with his blood and grief savings, the fate still caught up with him. A few years later, he died of AIDS. Recently, on October 10, 2022, the Rwandan businessman and politician Felicien Kabuga was put on trial in The Hague. This man was the founder of Free Radio and Television of the Thousand Hills and fully financed it. Kabuga, like Cantano, managed to slip away in time. He escaped to Europe and successfully evaded justice for 23 years. He was arrested in 2020 near Paris. The perpetrator let his guard down, thinking that he had been forgotten. Kabuga was a powerful man in Rwanda. His actions were planned and rational. He married one daughter to the eldest son of the president and another daughter to the son of the planning minister, a future accomplice in the genocide. This ensured the mutual cover-up and the inviolability of his position. In 1993, Kabuga used his own money to buy and bring into the country 500,000 machetes and other farm implements, which is much cheaper than firearms. Such weapons do not immediately draw attention to the events and at the same time are safe for the government itself. The other step was the financing and mobilization of the Hutus into a sort of non-governmental mercenary force called Interahamwe. Interahamwe means those who work together. Later, on Free Radio and Television on the Thousand Hills, working together became the signal for raids with machetes and slaughtering Tutsis. Kabuga then launched the Thousand Hills Free Radio and Television, where he became an investor and general manager. On his shows, as was widely known, Tutsis were being dehumanized. They were called cockroaches, and their killing was considered an act of patriotism and defense of sovereign democracy. Felician Kabuga hid for 23 years, changed several countries' names and passports. The U.S. announced a $5 million reward for information about him, and only recently, the 86-year-old fugitive was arrested in a respectable suburb of Paris. Following all these bloody events, there was a change in the elite. There was an influx of foreign investment and humanitarian aid. The activities of charitable organizations expanded widely. In accordance with the official ideology, there are no longer tribal divisions in the country. There are only Rwandans, a single nation. Yet, how exactly did they manage to survive and process such an experience? What actions were taken in the first days after the genocide ended? Of course, realizing the consequences, the most active killers managed to flee the country. They were joined by hundreds of thousands of ordinary Hutus who simply feared for their future. Others, however, stayed where they were and greeted the Tutsi victors with no idea of what was to come. Needless to say, the first act was revenge. The RPF fighters targeted those suspected of being involved in genocide. Most of the suspected perpetrators were not killed, but jailed. Soon, 120,000 such suspects were piled up in prisons. At that time, there were about 6 million people living in Rwanda. Once in power, the RPF faced an extremely difficult question: how to rule a country where so many people were massacred. Perhaps simply realizing that a minority could not rule by terror, the authorities managed to restrain themselves from the most destructive, impulsive decisions and terror. The Hutu massacres were quickly stopped, followed by a complex multi-stage effort to overcome the recent horrific experience. First of all, the authorities launched a program of civic education. People of all ages were enrolled in Inganda training camps, where instructors taught people of varying educational backgrounds and life experiences that the Hutus and Tutsis were one people who had been divided by white colonizers. It is hard to say how persuasive such instruction seemed to those Rwandans who were used to thinking otherwise. Still, the fact that people were simply being told how to treat each other now, after all that had happened, may have been an important message to some. Programs about the unity of the Rwandan people and the tragedy of the genocide were mandatorily included in school instruction. The authorities did not intend to forget the recent massacres, but they did not plan to turn the proceedings into a vigilante massacre. Dealing with the terrible task of how to assess and evaluate a massacre in which hundreds of thousands of people were involved, they took an ambiguous move. The investigation of the circumstances of the genocide was entrusted to the special courts of Gakaka. They consisted of judges who had no special legal education. Such tribunals were established in every village. The trials were held in the presence of the inhabitants, and participation was mandatory. Victims and perpetrators were seated opposite each other and forced to tell what happened. Such trials themselves were a form of collective therapy. The confession and remorse of the perpetrators were considered a circumstance that significantly mitigated the sentence. From 2002 to 2012, such courts handed down 1.2 million sentences. As much as possible, they considered all the episodes that people remembered. The sentences were handed down quickly. However, given the reason for their imposition, they were less severe. Only 3% of the defendants were found to be active participants and organizers of the genocide and were sentenced to long prison terms ranging from 30 years to life imprisonment. Almost 70% of the sentences related to the looting of Tutsi property, in which case the courts tried perpetrators and victims by determining measures of compensation for losses. For example, participants in looting were forced to build new houses for the victims. Average perpetrators of murders received prison sentences of up to 20 years. However, a voluntary confession, especially one made before the trial began, halved the sentence. In addition, half of the remaining term could be replaced by community service, and in many cases, convicts were given conditional release after a few years. Such processes cannot be called legally flawless, but being reminiscent of popular revolutionary justice, they did not become a tool of terror. By and large, the country was turned into one re-education camp with a relatively moderate regime for many years. That is such a tragic and at the same time eye-opening story. We're curious to hear your opinion about this story in the comments. At this point, we get to the end of our video. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon and give this video a big thumbs up.